There's a house at the end of a quiet street, in a town you have never heard of, in a state where nothing unusual ever happens. The kind of place where neighbors wave from their driveways and children ride their bikes until the streetlights come on. The kind of place where, if you asked anyone who lived there, they would tell you, without hesitation, that it was the safest neighborhood in the world. And for 43 years, they were right. Then, on a Tuesday morning in October, a man walked out of that house, got into his car, drove to work, waved to his co-workers, attended a meeting, ate lunch at his desk, and drove home. He made dinner. He watched the news. He went to bed at 10:15, exactly as he did every single night. By all accounts, it was the most ordinary day of his life. Except that it wasn't. Because sometime between midnight and 3 in the morning of that same Tuesday, while the rest of that quiet street slept, something happened inside that house that would take investigators over 2 years to fully understand. Something that, even after the verdict was read and the courtroom fell silent, left the lead detective staring at the ceiling of her bedroom at 4 in the morning, still asking the same questions she had been asking since the very beginning. How does a person do something like that, and then just go on living? His name was Richard Allen Kessler, 51 years old, an electrical engineer with 22 years at the same company. He coached his son's Little League team for 4 consecutive seasons. He served 2 terms on the Neighborhood Association board. He donated to the local food bank every Thanksgiving without fail. He was, by every metric available to the people around him, an exceptionally normal man. His wife Carol had known him since they were 19 years old. They met at a college party in the fall of 1989, and she would later tell investigators that from the very first night, she felt she understood him completely. He was quiet, she said, methodical, the kind of man who always knew exactly what he wanted, and worked steadily and without drama to get it. She described their marriage as calm. She described their home as peaceful. She described their life together as everything she had ever hoped for. What Carol did not know, what no one around Richard Kessler knew, was that for at least 11 years, possibly longer, her husband had been living inside a version of reality that bore almost no resemblance to the one everyone else could see. They have identified a situation, in Kessler's case, a marriage he had come to regard as an obstacle to a life he believed he deserved. And they have applied to that situation the same cognitive tools they use in every other area of their lives. The result is a plan that is not driven by hatred or rage or desperation, but by something almost colder than any of those things. A calm and thoroughgoing belief that the end, underneath the cookouts and the board meetings and the Thanksgiving donations, something else had been quietly taking shape. Something patient, something extraordinarily detailed, something that, when investigators finally began to piece it together, would force them to confront a question that criminologists and psychologists have debated for decades. Is it possible to plan a perfect crime? Not in a moment of rage or desperation, but over years, with the cold and deliberate precision of an engineer solving a problem. The answer, in Richard Kessler's case, was almost yes. The case began, as so many do, with something small. An anomaly so minor that a different investigator, someone less thorough, someone working a heavier caseload, might have overlooked it entirely. Detective Linda Marsh had been with the county sheriff's office for 19 years. She was 4 months from retirement. She had seen things in those 19 years that had reshaped her understanding of what human beings were capable of. And she believed, genuinely believed, that very little could still surprise her. She was wrong about that. The call came in at 6:47 in the morning. A welfare check, requested by Carol Kessler's sister, who lived 2 states away and had not been able to reach Carol by phone for 3 days. This, in itself, was not unusual. Carol sometimes went days without checking her messages. But her sister had a feeling, the kind of feeling that you cannot explain and cannot ignore. And so the call was made, and Linda Marsh was the one who answered it. She arrived at the house on Elm Creek Drive at 7:15. The lights were off. The car was in the driveway. The front door was locked. She knocked twice, waited, knocked again. Nothing. She walked around to the back and found the sliding glass door to the kitchen unlocked, which was not in itself alarming, except that Carol Kessler was the kind of woman who locked every door and window before she went to bed. Her sister had mentioned this specifically, had mentioned it almost as a character trait, the way some people describe someone as particular or careful. Linda Marsh stepped inside. The kitchen was clean. The dishes were done. There was a half-finished cup of coffee on the counter, cold. The cream still swirled at the surface, as if someone had just stepped away for a moment. The living room was undisturbed. The television remote was placed, as it always was, according to Richard, on the right arm of the sofa, at a precise right angle to the cushion. Everything was exactly where everything always was. And yet, standing in the middle of that perfectly ordered living room, Linda Marsh felt the hairs on the back of her neck rise in a way she had not felt in years. She found Carol in the upstairs bedroom. She was alive. They have identified a situation. In Kessler's case, a marriage he had come to regard as an obstacle to a life he believed he deserved. And they have applied to that situation the same cognitive tools they use in every other area of their lives. The result is a plan that is not driven by hatred or rage or desperation, but by something almost colder than any of those things, a calm and thoroughgoing belief that the ends justify whatever means are necessary, combined with an absolute confidence in their own ability to execute those means without detection. This confidence, Forsyth explained, is not arrogance in the conventional sense. It is not the bravado of someone who believes the rules do not apply to them. It is something more like the quiet certainty of a craftsman who has mastered his tools. Kessler did not believe he was smarter than everyone around him in some grandiose way. He simply believed, based on decades of being competent, being thorough, being the person in every room who had read the fine print, that if he was careful enough, patient enough, methodical enough, he would not be caught. And for a very long time, he was right. What investigators found when they finally obtained a warrant to search his home office was not what they expected. There were no dramatic confessions, no evidence of a disordered or tormented mind. What there was, filed in a locked drawer behind a false panel that had been professionally constructed and painted to match the surrounding wall, was a collection of notebooks, 11 of them, dating back 9 years, written in a handwriting so small and precise that the forensic document examiner later described it as almost mechanical. In those notebooks, Richard Kessler had documented, with extraordinary detail and care, every aspect of a plan that had been evolving, being revised, being refined, for nearly a decade. He had researched medications. He had studied case files of similar crimes, not to replicate their mistakes, but to catalog and avoid them. He had made and discarded 17 distinct versions of his plan, noting in the margins of each one exactly why it was insufficient, exactly where it might fail, exactly what a competent investigator would look for, and therefore what he needed to ensure left no trace. He had even, in the final notebook, written what amounted to a post-event timeline, a detailed account of what he intended to do in the days and weeks after, how he would present himself, what emotions he would display, how long he would wait before each subsequent step. He had thought of almost everything, almost. The detail that Richard Kessler had not accounted for was not a forensic one. It was not a fingerprint or a fiber or a digital trail. It was something far more human, and in retrospect, far more inevitable. It was the particular way that Linda Marsh paid attention to people. In the days following the incident, Marsh interviewed Kessler 4 times. Each time, he was cooperative, composed, and appropriately distressed. Not dramatically so, not in a way that felt performed, but in exactly the measured, controlled way that you might expect from a quiet, methodical man who had just discovered that his wife of 30 years had nearly died in their home. He answered every question fully. He never became defensive. He never asked to have a lawyer present. He appeared, in every observable way, to be exactly what he presented himself as: a devastated husband, doing his best to help. But Linda Marsh had spent 19 years watching people talk about terrible things, and she had developed, over those years, a sensitivity to a particular kind of stillness in a person. A stillness that was not the stillness of grief or shock, but the stillness of management. The stillness of a person who is not experiencing an emotion so much as performing it from a safe, internal distance. She could not have articulated this in court. She could not have put it in a report, but it stayed with her, that stillness, in the way that certain things stay with you long after the rational mind has moved on. She went back to the notebooks. Not the obvious ones. Those had already been analyzed and cataloged. She went back to the earliest ones, the ones from 9 years prior. And she began reading them not as a prosecutor looking for evidence, but as someone trying to understand a mind. And it was there, in a single entry from the 3rd notebook, that she found it. A reference so oblique that 2 separate forensic analysts had flagged it as irrelevant. 7 words, written in Kessler's precise, small hand, that described not a plan or a procedure or a medication dosage, but a feeling. A feeling he had had on a specific evening, sitting at his desk while his wife watched television downstairs, that he described as the first moment of real clarity he had experienced in years. Marsh cross-referenced the date of that entry with the couple's financial records, their phone records, their medical records, and the calendar Carol kept on the refrigerator. What she found connected a thread that no one had thought to pull, a thread that led, slowly and then all at once, to a name, a second name. Someone who had been inside that house regularly for nearly a decade. Someone Carol trusted completely. Someone who had been so thoroughly woven into the fabric of ordinary life on Elm Creek Drive that no one had thought to look at them twice. The arrest came on a Thursday morning, 16 months after the initial welfare check. It was quiet, as these things sometimes are when the person being arrested has spent years preparing themselves psychologically for the possibility. Richard Kessler said nothing when the handcuffs went on. He looked, witnesses later said, less like a man being taken into custody and more like a man who had finally reached the end of a very long calculation and was waiting with a kind of grim patience to see what the final answer would be. The trial lasted 14 days. The prosecution presented 206 pieces of evidence. The defense argued, not without some foundation, that the notebooks were the product of a disturbed fantasy life that had never been acted upon. That Richard Kessler was a troubled man, yes, but not a criminal one. And that the evidence connecting him to what had happened to Carol was circumstantial, in ways that reasonable doubt was designed to address. It was a competent defense. It was not enough. The jury deliberated for 9 hours. They returned a verdict on a Wednesday afternoon. Kessler received the maximum sentence. He has never spoken publicly about the case. He has filed 2 appeals. Both have been denied. He is currently housed in a medium security facility where, by all accounts from the corrections staff, he is a model prisoner. Quiet, methodical, cooperative. The kind of inmate who reads in his cell, causes no trouble, and gives everyone around him very little reason to think about him at all. What does the Kessler case tell us about the human mind? Dr. Forsyth, when I asked her this question at the end of our conversation, was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something that I have thought about many times since. She said that what disturbs her most about cases like this is not the darkness of the act itself, but the absolute normalcy of the architecture surrounding it. The cookouts, the Little League games, the precise placement of the television remote, the way a person can construct an entire life as a kind of stage set, not because they are incapable of connection or emotion, but because they have decided, somewhere along the way, that their internal world is the only one that is fully real, and that everyone else in their life is, in some fundamental sense, a variable in a problem they are trying to solve. That, she said, is not a dramatic psychological break. That is not madness. That is something colder and stranger, and in some ways, more human than we are comfortable admitting. Because the capacity for that kind of thinking, the capacity to reduce another person to a problem, to plan around them rather than love them, is not the exclusive property of monsters. It exists on a spectrum, and most of us, if we are honest, have stood somewhere on that spectrum at least once in our lives. The difference, Forsyth said, is almost entirely a matter of degree. And the ability to recognize that, she believes, is not just an academic exercise. It is, in the most practical sense, a matter of survival. Carol Kessler recovered fully. She sold the house on Elm Creek Drive 14 months after the trial. She has not spoken publicly about her husband or the case. By all accounts, she is doing well. She has a garden. She has her sister nearby. She has, by her own telling, rebuilt something she is careful not to describe as a life, because that word feels too close to the old one. She calls it, simply,